and the rest of the sessions you'll be taking part in. So my name is Dahlia Thornton, and I am the Director of the Research and Collective Bargaining Department at AFSCME, which is a public employee union. I work out of the National Union here in DC. I'll be the moderator for this session that is entitled The Use of Public Funds for Business Incentives. So hopefully you're in the right session, and if you're not, stay anyway, because I think you're going to learn some really great things. So we hope to keep you around. Today I'm joined by three wonderful panelists who are really going to give you some different perspectives, which is really exciting. They have some different ideas and some different thoughts on this topic. In the end, our hope is really that you come away from this with some best practices of what we can really do and what makes sense in terms of sharing with your decision makers about transparency and the use of public funds for business incentives. With that, I am going to ask each panelist to briefly tell us who they are and what they do, and then we'll get started with our questions. So I will start with Sarita Nair.
Thank you, Dahlia. I'm Sarita Nair. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer of the City of Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Great. Thank you, Sarita. And next we have Ronnie Bryant.
Thank you, Nyla, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm currently principal of Ronnie L. Bryant, LLC, an economic development consulting firm. I retired from full-time economic development 30 years, about 2 years ago.
Great. Thank you, Ronnie. And finally, we have Greg Leroy. Oh, you're muted, Greg.
Sorry. I'm Greg Leroy, the Executive Director of Good Jobs First. We're a nonprofit group, 22 years old, based in Washington, that focuses on transparency and accountability in business incentives.
Great. Thank you, Greg. So before we get to our actual questions, I do want you to know we've got a hard stop at 5 before the hour. We want to make sure we give you an opportunity to log out of this session and to log into another session. And we also want to leave an opportunity to ask some questions at the end. So we'll be doing that at the end as well. So to get us started, my first question is actually for you, Greg. How much information should the public be allowed to receive and or practices and participate in the business incentive process? So how much is it?
Well, you're asking the person who's been trying to pry open this box for a long time. You know, we think that we understand that there is secrecy involving negotiations prior to when deals are finalized, but we also favor as much disclosure ahead of time before deals are finally legally approved by elected boards and planning councils and so on, so that the public can participate and comment and try to amend or approve or disapprove of pending deals. And then once deals are done, we're very big on having the disclosure of the deals and the outcomes of the deals, and they often play out for 10 or 20 years, fully disclosed online. In fact, we've been grading the states since 2007 on that, and we have 4 databases, 2 of which are dedicated just to incentive disclosures.
Great. So my next question is actually for you, Ronnie. Can you talk about whether this transparency that Greg is trying to pry the box open on a bit here, can you talk a little bit about if that risks any economic incentive deals, or if you think that could actually put them in danger?
Well, if I have my way, he'll keep prying another 20 years. But that's, and I say that facetiously, but as a practicing economic developer, I'm not against public understanding the situation, but I do believe that public understanding has to come prior to the beginning of a negotiation. A particular incentive program, any incentive program, should be written, and the guidelines and the limitations of that program can be made public prior to the negotiation. You can get public comment, you can get whatever engagement with the public you want. Once the negotiations start, the negotiator for the public sector is within the guidelines of the program that has been approved. And then they get to use their discretion, the little discretion that they may or may not have in that. And sometimes it's purely statutory. There is no discretion whatsoever. And then afterwards, after the deal is approved, I'm totally with Greg. It should be open to public disclosure. But the process with the company of the negotiations, no, I would not want to be involved in a negotiation where you're now negotiating with the citizens of a community.
So what I'm hearing you say, Ronnie, is before and after, but that in between negotiations piece.
Exactly. Exactly.
Very good. So Sarita, I would love for you to talk a little bit about how having the public involved, from your position, you have a very different vantage point. How can having the public involved affect the deals? And do you think that having more information actually makes a difference in the end product on these deals?
Sure. So, I've sat at a couple of different seats at this table. I was in private practice for a decade, taking very much the position that Mr. Bryant just articulated, which is every single word in our application for an incentive is a trade secret that we will never disclose. And then I moved to the state auditor's office, where we pushed for maximum transparency in economic development deals. And now, somewhat oddly, I'm sort of right here in the middle, where we have to actually make those policy choices. And I agree with Mr. Bryant about transparency before the deal and in criteria. Our process is a little bit hybrid. So obviously, confidentiality agreements are basically table stakes for any deal, that, especially if it includes an out-of-town company. But we then, before the ink is all the way dry, we take our deals to the Albuquerque Development Commission, and then they have to go to the City Council. So there are 2 rounds of public process and transparency that occur there. And usually we can give the company the assurance that those will happen quickly, so that between when everything is confidential and when everything would be public under every world, they like to keep that to like 1 or 2 weeks. And that's sort of how we've hit that middle ground. But we found a lot of value in having that piece of transparency. And I'll give you an example. We have done a lot of great deals in the film community. And we have a great thriving film industry in New Mexico and in Albuquerque. But when we took one of those deals to that public part of that process, we heard from a lot of people in the industry, especially people of color, that there were limited opportunities to get sort of above the line, what they call in the industry above the line credits. So directing, producing, writing, whereas the below the line opportunities, catering and all that kind of stuff were more ample. And they just said, we really wish you had negotiated that type of provision into this deal. And so we were able to both make some accommodations in that deal, but also move that into our criteria moving forward, that we want apprenticeships and we want education. And so I think the bottom line is, we in City Hall don't know everything. And the other folks in the economic development world aren't necessarily always motivated to tell you everything. And so that's the value of having some transparency before the ink is all the way dry.
Mm-hmm. Great. Greg, I want to give you an opportunity to talk to Ronnie a little bit about this idea of no transparency at all. And, we're all friends here, so we're going to stay friends. But talk a little bit about why you think even the negotiations process, or, if you think even the negotiations process, there should be more transparency there, because I think that you all might be on different sides of that. So if you could talk a little bit about why. Ronnie's very clear. When those negotiations are happening, that door is shut. What do you think about that?
Well, so here's the bigger issue here, is that we have a system, a tax break industrial complex system that has evolved since the late 1930s. It actually has lots of moving parts and names that can be named historically. And it has served to hamstring public officials and allow the private sector to dominate the process, especially the control of information, which is central to the playing of the states against each other, the so-called war among the states, or race to the bottom. And so we're all about trying to give public officials a better poker hand when it comes to bargaining, to get better deals. And we think that they'll be served in that respect by having the public know more about the process and about individual deals. So I just want to make sure that's where we're coming from here. And journalists obviously play a critical role in that, because they're reporting on these dockets as they unfold and these deals. I also think there could be some distinctions to be made between small deals and big deals, especially big deals that involve big changes of land use or big clearance or demolition, potential displacement or gentrification. If you're going to have a big project that involves a big land use change, we think there really needs to be neighborhood meetings about that and lots more buy-in about, can there be a community benefits agreement to make sure that the incumbent residents have a chance to benefit directly from the process, from the project, rather than just getting shoved out, for example. But, and I'm glad that Albuquerque gives a week or two. We had a project for many years in New York City that won 12 days before the Industrial Development Agency's docket was released, complete with every application, every cost benefit study, to an email list which people could voluntarily sign up for, so that anybody could come to the meeting and support, oppose, amend, whatever they wanted to each project. We think there's a middle ground to be struck on that.
And Ronnie, what changes if there is that open door? What changes if there's sort of this idea of more transparency? So if we did even open it a crack a bit, what's going to change in your deal? How will it look different?
Dahlia, let me maybe do a little bit more direct response to Greg's comment. He knew it was coming. So one of the problems that I have, and not specifically with Greg, but those in his camp that really push the full disclosure argument, is that they kind of lump things together, and they lump all projects together. And as within any particular industry, you have good deals and you have bad deals, and you have good practitioners and you have bad practitioners, and communities and organizations that truly understand the nature of incentives and the value incentives can play in a particular project, and also understand the fiscal responsibility to their community relative to protecting the resources, especially the financial resources of that community. Those are organizations that are going to get it right. And you develop programs where you require a economic impact analysis, one that's credible, that truly shows that whatever level of incentive you're putting into this project, the statute should mandate that there be a positive return to the community. And you could even be as specific as stating a certain percentage return. So you really can make it as aggressive as you want to. And understand, incentives are designed to make a good deal better, not make a bad deal good. And so the project itself must make sense for the community. And another point I like to make is, when you talk about the private sector running the process, well, I would agree to a certain extent. Understand, incentives were created by the public sector. And we have created Frankenstein. And he's going to eat us if we don't get our arms around it. And public disclosure is not the issue. The whole notion of who's driving the process, and I agree fully with Greg, there are some such situations when the private sector actually can take control. But again, that's when you have a weak public sector or a weak economic development organization that allows that kind of control to take place. And finally, I want to follow up on Greg's comments regarding the big land use deals and gentrification and so forth. Zoning, gentrification, displacement, those are not incentive topics. Those are issues that are settled before a piece of property is even put on the market for a developer. So if the community has agreed to rezone this residential property to commercial, and it's going to result in gentrification of dislocation or relocation of citizens, that decision is not made during the negotiation of incentive. That's a zoning commission land use decision that's made long before you even involve a developer, or as part of your 20-year master plan, or however your community chooses to plan and strategize around land use. That's not a negotiation issue.
So Ronnie, I want to lean into one of the answers that you had there, is that not all deals are the same. And I don't think anyone on our panel today would say, oh no, everyone is dealing with this in the exact same way. So there are some folks who are doing it right. And one of the things we want to be able to do here is effectively mine out some of the pieces where people are doing things right. I think, where Sarit has been involved, like they really are doing a lot of things. What we would say they're doing it right. How do we get the folks who are not doing it right to get there? So there are going to be some of these deals that are happening and they're not doing the right thing by their community, and they're not paying attention, and they're not saying this is what's best for our workers. How do we get them there? And aside from sort of doing the thing that I think Greg is saying is shine a light on it and make it public. So what are the options?
I want to just be absolutely honest with you. Some people will never get it right because some communities, unfortunately, they work from the position of desperation. They need a deal. The community needs a deal. The mayor wants a deal. The economic developer's job is on the line. He or she needs a deal. Well, when you need a deal, how much is too much? How many times do I walk in the mayor's office and say, well, we sent this company away because that wasn't a good deal. Next week, that wasn't a good deal. That wasn't a good deal. Well, I'm sorry, that gets old after a while. And there is this belief that economic developers love incentives. We hate incentives. I would love to get back to the era when we competed on our assets and we took the inducements off the table. That would be nice, but I'm going to let the others stop first, and I'll catch up. But it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen as long as some communities need a deal. Economic developers are under a tremendous amount of pressure. I'm looking at Ms. Nair when I say that as a city official. She wants her economic development people to produce results so her elected bosses can stand up and do what elected bosses do. Smile and say what they've done. That's the nature of the game. And if you can't feed that beast as a practitioner, you won't survive in this business. If you want, to Greg's point, and again, I'm not into the public negotiation piece, but but if you want a smarter use of incentives, you've got to look at it from a more systemic perspective and help communities, to your point, Dahlia, communities who are doing bad deals, help them find a way to be able to do good deals and still win. Because at the end of the day, if you're not winning, you're losing.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Ronnie. I think that history teaches me that sunshine is central to helping states and especially local governments not be so desperate and not misbehave. If you look at the 4 cities that won our most recent report card study for having the best transparency, they're all cities in which community groups have persistently protested for many years the lack of community input and the impediments and the barriers to participation that they found in the process, central to which were disclosure and public meetings practices. So Memphis, Chicago, Austin, New York, they all have robust disclosure systems now for many of their major incentive programs, but there's a long knockdown, drag out history behind each one of those rules. They did not happen out of the goodness of the hearts of those public officials. They happened because community groups were persistently crawling inside the beast and asking a lot of rude questions. So, and look, but in the end, the public officials like what happened. I mean, we got thanked publicly by the Industrial Development Agency of New York City after overhauling their process in a 13 or 14-year knockdown dragout. And they, I think, acknowledged that they had a better process and they were doing better deals thanks to us opening the doors. But it took a long time.
I could appreciate, and I don't want to hog the time here in case Ms. Nair wants to jump in here, but you're picking low-hanging fruit, Greg. The cities you name, they're going to be good cities anyway. Those are not the ones that are doing terribly bad deals. Maybe they were doing some things that you thought maybe needed to be, maybe there needed to be more public disclosure, and that's probably good. But Austin, Chicago, give me a break, man. Memphis, come on, these cities are going to be okay. Good deal or bad deal. But there are some cities that don't have the assets, the quality of life of an Austin, of a Memphis, or Chicago. And they're not the first choice on anybody's list. And so when the elected officials said, how do we get a deal? That's when your bad incentive deal come into play.
Let me ask Sarita, as I think you do have a very unique position. If I think you're in a wonderful city. You're in Albuquerque, which is amazing. If you are in a city that, they needed a deal, and you didn't have those, sort of what Ronnie's laying out here, you didn't have those other things that are bringing people there. How do you rectify that? How do you deal with that when you're trying to bring business in? What are there other options that are out there, or is this really sort of the only option that's out there is to offer some of these incentives?
So first of all, yes, we are in one of those great cities that everyone should want to be picking first. It should be at the top of every list. We're also just, especially in the COVID era, we're healthy, we're resilient, we're kind of crushing it on COVID. So, definitely Albuquerque should be at the top of your list. That said, I think, and I completely agree with the fact that the dynamic exists where people are hungry for a deal. But I think it is also incumbent on us as elected and appointed officials to say, but what does that deal look like? So we have, 6 pillars in our economic development strategy, and one of them is building the local economy and making economic development incentives as available to local businesses as they are when we woo that out-of-state big fish. And that in itself lends to transparency, because now you're offering an incentive to a company that's been in the newspaper for 20 years because they've been here and we know them. And then we also have another pillar about the creative economy that has to do with supporting artists in the gig economy and making sure that they also have some level of support or subsidy or platform, so that we're making those opportunities equally available to everyone. And so I think it is somewhat on us to also say, a deal is not the only means to develop the economy, and is sometimes the most costly and most risky, because they come and then they go. And we're much better off investing those assets with the folks who are homegrown, as we like to say.
Great. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, because I do want to get at this idea of how do we do this? How do we get there? So this question is for Greg. What would be the law changes that you would recommend that would be most important to improve transparency? Obviously, just asking nicely is probably not the best way to make it happen. So, are there changes in law that could be useful here?
Yes, and they need to happen at the state level because state law governs local economic development incentive practices. So, I think the 2 big pillars for transparency would be process. That is requiring a certain number of days between when incentive negotiations are finalized and before they are approved by the city council, the county board, whatever the final authorizing body is. And then online ongoing disclosure, deal-specific, company-specific disclosure of the costs and benefits of every deal as long as it plays out. And there's lots of great practice on that latter front. Many states do it well now. And every state does it to some degree. We've got them all in the disclosure column to some degree.
Great. Sarita, I would ask you, do you have any thoughts as well on this? Do you have anything else to add in terms of the law changes?
I agree with Greg. I think also the parameters of what you can do in certain deals are also going to be a factor. So, for example, our city local economic development ordinance act does require a 10-year commitment from a company. So if there is consensus around in the community about those basic deals, having that codified is really important, because it becomes just the ante. If you want to come to Albuquerque, you know that's the situation. And so that's also a level of transparency to the companies we're trying to attract, which is also really important. I mean, we've heard from many companies that they get the bait and switch when they go into other markets, and that's something that every company is afraid of. So being transparent about what our expectations are should actually be good for the business of recruiting as well.
Great.
I would revert back to my earlier comment. I'm overwhelmingly in favor of as stringent of public guidelines as the community would require prior to the beginning of the negotiations, and make the process or make the guidelines of the program as tough as you want to whatever level you feel protects and gives the community the fiscal responsibility that it's looking for. And that's fine. And if that even impacts your competitiveness, if you understand that, that's fine. That you know that going in. And you said as a community, you're taking a stand. This is what I want. I am not in favor of, once you start that process, that you open up the actual negotiation. And then in the end, any information relative to the public sector's commitment to this project should be made public, not the private sector information of the company data and information, only the public sector. It should be made public, every bit of it.
So what I'm hearing, I think, from all three panelists, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there should be some, really a best practice here is setting your course before you get into the deal. Having conversations early on about what does our community think makes sense in terms of these sorts of incentive deals, or the deals generally. What makes sense to us? What are our going to the mat issues? Like, we absolutely will not allow this to come into our city, state. Really setting those things up before you actually get into the deal, and then things start getting traded off that don't really make sense and don't feel good to the community at large. Is that at least one thing that we can say, that doing this early and having some public buy-in early is something that everyone agrees to on the panel?
Yes.
Great. So I'm gonna do the thing that we knew was coming. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the idea of whether or not. So I'm going to talk about HQ2 for just a quick second, and talk about what in terms of the public benefit and the public benefits and public goods that are out there. So I'm going to ask this question actually of all three of you. So if you have a quick second to think, but are these sorts of bidding wars that seem to be happening between the states for companies to come to them, which I think arguably that might have happened with HQ2, are these bidding wars ending up costing taxpayers more than the public benefit that is actually realized? And so I think, again, this played out in a pretty interesting way with HQ2. And so does that happen? Was that sort of an anomaly? Or are these bidding wars really not taking the public benefit into account when they're thinking about trying their very hardest to attract someone? So I'm throwing that out there, and I would love each one of you to answer it. And I feel like you're all chomping at the bit. So I'll start with Greg, because you're at the top of my screen.
Okay, and we've been trying to quantify this very question. So the core question you just asked there is, do the costs exceed the benefits in these bidding wars? And certainly the HQ2 auction stands as an example of both overbidding and also really bad, the lessons that can be learned from the pros and cons of good disclosure. So for example, Toronto disclosed its bidding document, its 85-page bidding document, immediately upon filing it. And even though they didn't win the HQ2 deal, they won many other deals since then, and they attribute a lot of it to the fact that they laid bare their bid and used that as kind of a calling card for other tech companies. And we think all the other cities that didn't disclose, and there was a page that we cooperated with at Muckrock, the Cooperative Investigative Journalism website, to gather those bids that had been disclosed. We think everybody should have disclosed at that point once they didn't make the cut, or even and then after the final cut was made, to use it in the same way Toronto did. But to answer your question directly, we track big deals. We pay extra attention to big deals, so-called mega deals, $50 million and up, and some of them are billions of dollars for individual projects. Our latest calculation shows that the average cost per job for those mega deals, and we have about 400 that we've documented, is $658,000 per job. And at that rate, nobody can ever, no government, no taxpayer can ever break even, right? There's no way that anybody working in a microchip plant or a chemical plant or a data center is going to pay $658,000 more in state and local taxes than they and their families consume in public services. It just can't happen, no matter how good those jobs are, because state and local taxes aren't that high. So all we can say for sure in transactions of that magnitude is that there's a large transfer of wealth going on between from taxpayers to corporate shareholders.
Great. Sarita, what do you think about this?
So, we were not in office when the Amazon stuff happened, the HQ2 bidding war. But after we got here, we had to deal with some information requests regarding the city's proposal. And unfortunately, there was the folks did not take the adequate safeguards to protect the bid or some of the crosstalk about the bid. And so we produced some of that information because we thought that was the right thing to do, and also the legal requirement. And, I thought it told a really interesting story. There were people who said, actually, we should offer nothing. And we should say, you should come to Albuquerque because it's awesome. And then there were other people who said, we should give you the convention center to use as an office. And there was everything in between. And so I do think it is ultimately about, how confident you are in your assets as a city, whether you're going to engage in that type of race to the bottom bidding, or if you're just going to put your best strengths forward and live and die by those. So I don't think, again, there's nothing like inherent about the process that forces people to give away the farm. It's just a decision I think that people make because they don't think they have any alternative.
I would definitely agree. And I think the HQ2 project is probably in having this type of discussion, that's probably one of the worst examples because it's such an outlier. It was definitely one of the bigger projects that I've ever seen before, but in the way that it was handled, it was definitely unique. And so, and I'll come back to that. I said earlier, and I still believe that if a community requires, or a state requires, like the state of North Carolina here does, requires that you run a legitimate economic development analysis on every project and the incentives involved in that project. And that analysis has to show a positive result. And that keeps you away from that quote unquote race to the bottom mentality, to where you're actually making a fiscally responsible decision when you put an incentive deal on the table. And I think if communities follow that practice and really look at the project for what it is, with the incentive being provided as a a reduction of the cost into the market, which will eventually pay for itself over X number of years. And there are some good tools that can help you figure that out. There has to be a responsible approach and discussion around the use of incentives. And if this process starts in the beginning, I think the public will have a lot more confidence in what being done by their officials, and therefore maybe minimize some of the pressure to want to open up the process to the public. Now, HQ2 for a second. Having a project that, number one, totally anybody can respond to, that's very unique. I'll say so unique. I really, in my 30 years, I don't know another project that was like that, where anybody could reply or could submit an RFP or respond to an RFP. But in many communities, many of the 80+ communities, many communities went through the expense of preparing a proposal, and really there's no way they possess the infrastructure in an effort to support a project of that magnitude. And especially when you look at what was in the proposal and the requirements that HQ2 laid out for the communities that submitted. I personally led my organization's effort in HQ2. And so very intimately close to the process and very disappointed with the process in that regards also. And the reason is the criteria became a moving target. And what was publicized initially regarding what was important to the company changed at some point. And communities that made the short list didn't have the requirements that I was personally told that was required by the company. And so there was something else going on. But I think one of the primary objectives of that exercise was a data collection exercise. They now have the most extensive database of company information, community information relative to incentives, development plans, et cetera, just name it. And it didn't cost them a dime. It didn't cost them a dime, which is brilliant. And they can do a lot with that over the years, especially in their continual development of fulfillment centers around the country. Having that kind of information when you walk into a meeting negotiating a fulfillment center, it puts you, and back to Greg's comment, you're in charge. You're in charge of the discussion. And so in that end, to them, I give Amazon a lot of credit for that, but I think it was a terrible exercise. And I have spoken to many economic developers in the cities that I referenced that knew that they didn't have a prayer in landing the project, but they had to submit because of pressure from either private sector board members or elected officials in their communities. And so they spent a lot of money. But I will say in closing here, finally, large employers within a community that hired and depends on a comparable workforce to what Amazon was promising. Although they might have publicly supported the response, privately would tell you they did not want Amazon in their community.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I think the Amazon deal was certainly quite unique for many reasons, but I think exactly what you pointed out, Ronnie, was that this really was an awesome experiment on Amazon's behalf of just getting as much information as they possibly could, and that probably doesn't serve the public in the way that it could. So definitely, hopefully, a unique situation. Sarita, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that, we have a lot of journalists who are on, and so I want to make sure that they know, what questions would you suggest that the public would be asking about these deals?
Great question. So, first is sort of how you evaluate the deal. So I think that is always fair game of maybe you can't tell us the details of even where this is going to be, but what are you looking for in this deal? Because that's something that you can then hold people accountable against later. And then I think really drilling down on some of the words that are used. So like, for example, people talk about base jobs. And we had an incentive that we actually vetoed, and then the council overrode our veto to give incentives to essentially a entertainment, an entertainment venue. And we got very deep into the question of what is a base job versus just cannibalizing an existing limited set of economic resources. But ultimately that was good because I think now we have a pretty good community IQ of what that is. So I think the more journalists can kind of dig behind some of those buzzwords, you kind of get to the heart of it. And then finally, it's what Greg's been emphasizing is getting that progress along the way. So usually there are two economic development stories. It's grand opening and grand closing. And we need that story of every year along the way so that the community can really understand, especially the good stories. I mean, it is so impossible to get coverage of a good story sometimes, that if we took maybe the lens of accountability and saying, okay, is this company doing what it's supposed to be? Then in all those stories where the answer is yes and going above and beyond, we get to tell those success stories. But then when the company or the government is falling short, we get sunlight on that as well.
Great. Thank you. I think it's very helpful. So I'm going to ask you all one more question, and then we're going to actually go to some of the attendee questions. So I'm going to ask each of you to give me one way to do transparency right. If we could take one thing away from this, what is one way to do this right in terms of whether it's putting it into legislation or for the public officials? What's one way to do this right? Ronnie, I'll start with you.
Thank you. As I said, open up the development of the incentive program to the general public. Give the public an opportunity to have input on what the incentive program, statutory and or discretionary program looks like. Pretty simple in a statutory program, but if there's some discretion, what are the boundaries to the discretionary piece of it? All of that can be input at the beginning. Give the general public full openness to understanding and giving input to the process. And then at the end, open it up and show exactly where the negotiations ended up.
Great. Thank you. Sarita, what is your one way to do this right?
Say it's sort of the concept of transparency about how transparent you're going to be. So just make the rules of the game really clear. If there's going to be a public meeting, we can't talk about this now, but there is going to be 3 public meetings before this is finally approved, then just make that clear. And that is equally important to the companies. So I think a lot of times, we over-promise what degree of confidentiality we can even give to a prospective incentive recipient, and that doesn't help anyone either. So just being very clear about what the rules of the game are, especially with the community, but also with the companies too.
That's a great point. Thank you. And Greg, I'll end with you before we open it up to some questions. What is
Great.
one
And I
thing?
apologize. I just put into the chat box a few things that I'd accidentally sent only to the panelists instead of all the panelists plus the participants. So I've tried to resend things. So we've actually written model legislation on transparency and monitoring and clawbacks and enforcement. And it's all in that link that I just recently sent. And I agree very much with Sarita's point. Whatever the rules are, they should be clearly promulgated to everybody and equally enforced, no matter which company or deal you're talking about, so that everybody plays by the same rules. That's especially true, for example, in clawbacks right now. We have a lot of companies falling short because of the pandemic, and we're getting a lot of calls from reporters saying, well, shouldn't they cut them a break? And yes, maybe, but whatever the rules are, if you have a calibrated rule or a rewriting rule or a rescission rule or whatever the rule is, make it bright, make it black and white, and treat everybody the same.
Great. Wonderful. And I do want to say that all of the links that Greg has put into the chat box will be sending to the attendees. So don't worry, you will certainly get those. So one of our first attendee questions was actually about clawbacks, Greg, and just wondering about what should the transparency be about that? And then in terms of the success of the deals. And I think it's transparency about clawbacks and success of the deals. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, and I'm hastily dropping in another link here because we have a study for that. Some people have apps, we have studies for that. So I just put in the box a big study we did looking at 4 or 5 major programs in every state and asking the question, how well or poorly does the state monitor and enforce the requirements of the deals under the incentives in those programs? And the big picture is pretty encouraging. About 40% of major state programs are actually structured as what we call performance-based. That is, they are backloaded. The company doesn't get whatever the incentive is until the company, delivers on its end of the deal. And we think that's good, that's safe, and reduces taxpayer risk. The vast majority, more than 90% of the other programs that we looked at, do have some form of clawback written in, or rescission or recalibration or some combination thereof. That is, there is a provision to protect taxpayers if a company falls short on its end of the deal. The big problem we did find in too many of those rules, though, is that there's a wiggle room, that they don't have the bright line, that there is discretion for the Secretary of Commerce or whoever to say, well, they had a bad year, or they had unexpected market circumstances, or we're going to cut them a break. And when that happens, we just think you get into this icky poo land of, well, did the company give the governor a big contribution on his Lex campaign, or the mayor? Or, is there some other influence behind the scenes explaining that compassion for the company compared to other companies? We go back to the black and white, bright line, equal treatment argument.
And Greg, another question directly for you. You mentioned some of the big deals and across the country and the job costs. What about some of the smaller deals across the country? How much does the average job cost in those smaller deals?
Great question. And the answer is sometimes almost, virtually, 4 figures, let's put it that way. We've documented lots of deals, especially in training programs, workforce development programs, where the cost per job can be $2,000 or $4,000, not 200,000 or 200 million, or rather 2 million or 200,000. And we think that makes a lot of sense. We actually also dug deep into New Mexico and 13 other states in a study that I'll put in the chat here in a second, asking the question, how well or how poorly do states favor small and local and entrepreneurial businesses? Because obviously, especially now in the pandemic, but even before, we know smaller companies have the most trouble and need the most help, right? They don't have access to capital markets perhaps as well, or management depth or technology adaptation. They can benefit from customized assistance programs that states and counties and cities can offer to benefit lots of small companies. But unfortunately, we kept finding that if you look at deals that are programs that are theoretically open to companies of any size, 70% of the deals, 90% of the money was going to big companies, big multi-state, multinational companies. So our argument there was to sort of so-called means test corporate welfare. That is, just say this program is not eligible for companies above a certain size. We're going to be intentional about steering more resources to companies that demonstrably need it the most.
Our next question is actually for Ronnie. It looks like you had mentioned that sometimes with more, like in terms of the negotiations, that it looks like the deals might fall through. Have you seen deals actually fall through that you've seen, or at least, or even participated in, because of that transparency, because of that openness?
Most definitely. I have been party to, and then I'm aware of other deals that companies have walked away because of a leak in the process. And sometimes the leak might have been on our side, or the leak might have been on the side of the company, but the press was able to pick up a particular aspect of the project and really able to disclose more information about the process, different than the company was willing to have to be made public. And therefore they decided to walk. And that also exposes, at least in my opinion, a very contentious relationship between the press and the economic development community, as well as your government. And that's a point of competitiveness in economic development from my perspective. And I think communities should work very hard to ensure that they have at least they have a respectful relationship among government, ED, and the press.
Great. Thank you for that. So I have one more question that I wanted to ask, and any of you can feel free to jump in on this one, and then we're going to wrap up after that so we can make sure you get to your next session. But what is your assessment of the CARES Act, as well as other pandemic-related legislation that's given funds to companies?
I'd be happy to start that one.
Please.
So this for us has been a great way to show the impact that giving incentives to small and local companies can have. So we, back in May, were able to make $5,000 grants to micro businesses. So you had to have, I think, 5 employees or fewer. And the only thing we required them to do in their application was kind of tell their story and check some boxes about demographic information. But now we have, $750,000 worth of these grants on the street, and we're tracking their story to be able to say, this is the impact. And I think our dollars per job numbers are going to be off the chart on those. And similarly, we have like another $10 million now going to companies 50 or smaller. And we're doing things like commercial rent subsidies so that we're also having sort of a ripple effect so that the landlord is getting paid, but the company also gets a break. So I think CARES is a great time, if you're doing it right, to show the power that small dollar grants to homegrown companies can have on the economy as a whole.
Great. Anyone else?
I've put in the Dropbox the URL for our newest database, our 4th database called COVID Stimulus Watch. It's been up since May. We have more than 1 million lines of data from 21 different parts of the CARES Act. There's a lot of parts of it that are not as well known as the Paycheck Protection or EIDL programs. We also have looked a lot at the distinction between charter and private schools versus public education. And we also link it to our violation tracker. So we've helped to generate a lot of interest in all the money being given, for example, to healthcare chains, despite the fact that many of them have been repeatedly convicted of violating or scamming Medicare and Medicaid.
Great.
But we agree that there's great things to be done at the local level with the money that Sarita's talking about.
I totally, wholeheartedly agree with both Sarita and Greg in that regard.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, that does wrap up our session. I appreciate all of you joining and being wonderful participants, and for your excellent questions for the attendees. And then, of course, our amazing panelists who took the time, spent some time thinking about these issues and really brought their own their experience to this. Sometimes heated on different sides, but I think at the end we really are all interested in making sure that we have some really good best practices on this. So I want to thank Sarita, Ronnie, and Greg for their time. And of course, everyone at the National Freedom of Information Coalition for putting on this wonderful conference and for allowing our folks to show up and tell you some more about what we think in this area. So thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your excellent conference, and we appreciate your time. Thank you.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye.